if you've ever tried to map the movement of something spinning, a planet, a bicycle wheel, or even a tiny electron, you get a sense of angular momentum.
Right.
But when you shrink that concept down to the quantum level, everything you thought you knew, well, it completely changes.
And that's exactly where we're headed today. We are taking a deep dive into the core quantum mechanical treatment of angular momentum using Chapter 18 from the Feynman Lectures on Physics, Vol.3.
A classic.
It is. And for us, angular momentum, which we'll call J, isn't just about speed and mass. It's a deeply fundamental quantity. It acts like the universe's internal compass, really, determining how particles interact, where they go, how they polarize light.
So our mission today is to distill these concepts, conservation, combination, and measurement all, without, meeting a blackboard full of math. We want to get to the surprising, the really non-intuitive insights.
Yeah, and we should probably clarify something right up front.
Yeah.
When we talk about angular momentum in this quantum context, we're usually talking about two things. There's J, which is the total spin magnitude of the system, and then there's M. And M is the component of that spin along a specific axis, usually the z-axis.
So M is the specific state of rotation.
Exactly. And it's M that has to balance perfectly when a particle, say, makes a transition.
Okay, so let's unpack the simplest scenario first. Electric dipole radiation. This is where an excited atom gives off a photon and drops to a lower energy state. How does this conservation of M, how does it govern what the photon looks like?
The conservation rules here are, well, they're remarkably strict. If an atom is in an excited state with J equals 1 and its Z component, M is plus 1.
Right.
And it transitions down to the ground state where J is 0, M is 0. That atom has just lost 1 unit of angular momentum along that z-axis.
So the photon that's emitted must carry away that missing unit.
It has to, exactly. And the photon does that through its polarization. The particle that's required is a right-hand circularly polarized, or RHC, photon.
And it comes out along the positive z-axis.
Right. RHC light carries 1 unit of angular momentum in its direction of travel. It's a perfect match.
So conversely, if the atom started at M equals -1 and goes to the ground state, it has to spit out a left-hand circularly polarized and LHC photon to balance the books.
You've got it. The polarization of the emitted light is a direct measurement of the atom's internal state change.
That's a beautiful constraint.
It is, but the constraint doesn't stop there. Parity must also be conserved.
Parity, that's essentially what? A measure of how the system behaves if you invert it through the origin, like looking at it in a mirror.
That's a great way to think about it. If the physics looks the same in a mirrored universe, so if your initial state has, say, odd parity,
then the final state, plus the photon it emitted, must also have an overall odd parity.
Precisely. For simple dipole radiation, the initial and final states must have opposite parity. And this rule, this parity conservation, it acts as a critical selection rule. It determines which transitions are even allowed to happen in the first place.
Okay, now that we know how a single photon's spin gets decided, let's get a little more complex. What happens in a rapid chain of events, like light scattering? An atom absorbs a photon, gets excited for a moment,
and then immediately re-emits another one. A two-step process.
Right.
Conceptually, we have to calculate the amplitude for this whole event. And that amplitude is just the product of the two parts, the amplitude for absorption and the amplitude for re-emission.
And since the atom could absorb an RHC photon or an LHC photon and then re-emit either one,
We've got 4 distinct paths. The total scattering amplitude is a combination of all 4 possibilities.
So we're combining these quantum paths, and the final probability, which is the square of that total amplitude, tells us the intensity of the scattered light at any given angle.
That's right. And if you do the math for a very specific, very common setup, shining an x-polarized photon in and then looking for x-polar scattered light directly along the x-axis, you get a really striking result.
Which is?
The calculated intensity, 0.
0.
0. No scattered light is observed in that precise direction.
Wow. Okay, so 0 intensity for a scenario that seems like it should be physically probable. What is the... So what here? Because, I mean, that sounds like something a classical physicist could have calculated pretty easily.
And that's the profound insight. The classical theory of light scattering, with simple oscillating dipoles, it also predicts 0 intensity for this exact setup.
So it agrees.
It agrees. But the quantum mechanical treatment using conservation of angular momentum and the true nature of atomic J1 excited states, that's the real foundation.
Yeah.
The quantum result matches the classical one here, but it explains why the conservation must hold even when the atom doesn't act like a simple classical antenna. It validates the whole amplitude approach.
Okay, moving from light scattering to something, well, something far more esoteric, positronium annihilation.
Huh.
So we're talking about an electron and a positron bound together, then they just destroy each other and turn into pure energy. Two photons. How does angular momentum conservation deal with matter turning into light?
It's a great question. We focus on the positronium state, where the total angular momentum is J equals 1. Now, for this annihilation into two photons to happen, both angular momentum and parity must be conserved.
So if the positronium starts out in the J equals 1, M equals 0 state, how does that 1 unit of angular momentum get carried away by two photons that are flying off in opposite directions?
Well, the conservation rules are very strict. They forbid the two photons from having the same polarization. You can't have both be RHC, for example.
Okay, so they have to be opposite.
They have to be opposite. The final state must be a superposition, a mixture of two possibilities. Either photon 1 is RHC and photon 2 is LHC, or
The other way around. Photon 1 is LHC and photon 2 is RHC.
exactly. It's a perfectly balanced superposition of opposite angular momentum states.
And this leads us right into that famous paradox territory, the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox that Feynman talks about.
It does.
If these two photons are flying away from each other, and I measure the polarization of the first one, how does that instantly affect the second one, which could be light years away?
Well, if you set up a detector and you measure that first photon to be, say, x-polarized, the rules of quantum mechanics instantly tell you that the second distant photon must be x-polarized.
Instantly.
Instantly. They remain correlated across vast distances because they originate from the same quantum system.
Wait a minute. If the act of measuring it actually changes the physical nature, if it forces the system into a definite state, doesn't that just completely undermine the idea that objective properties like polarization even existed beforehand?
It does. That's the core of it. Quantum mechanics tells us they didn't have a definite polarization until the measurement was made. The correlation is what's fundamental, not their separate pre-existing properties.
So my measurement over here collapses the entire superposition.
Everywhere, at once. It's a choice. And that's why you can instantly know the state of the other photon. It completely challenges our classical idea of a local, objective reality.
Wow. Okay, to even grapple with these kinds of complex, rotating quantum correlations, we're going to need some serious mathematical machinery. So what exactly is the rotation matrix, this R sub y of theta?
The rotation matrix is, think of it like a mathematical map. It tells you exactly how the probability amplitudes of the different angular momentum states get scrambled when you physically turn your frame of reference.
Okay, so if I have a particle in state M and I rotate my measuring device.
By some angle theta, around the y-axis, let's say, this R sub y of theta matrix gives you the new amplitude for finding the particle in a different state, M prime.
So it defines how the original pure M states mix together to form this new rotated state.
Precisely. Rotating around the z-axis is easy. The states just get a simple phase change. But rotating around any other axis, like the ab-axis, it causes the different M states to mix in a really dramatic way. These matrices are the essential toolkit for predicting what angular distributions will look like after a system rotates or decays.
Let's see this map in action. Can we look at a real-world experiment, like determining an unknown nuclear spin? The source uses the example of the excited neon nucleus, Ni-20 star.
This is a really elegant application of the theory. So scientists created this excited nucleus by scattering alpha particles off of carbon-12. The goal was to figure out the unknown spin, the J, of this excited Ni-20 star state.
And they did this by measuring the angular distribution of the second alpha particle that's emitted when it decays?
Yes. And the key question is, why is the angle of that emitted particle so informative?
Right.
It's because that angular distribution, the curve that shows how many particles come out at various angles, is directly tied to the square of the rotation matrix elements. These matrices involve functions called Legendre polynomials, and the shape of the intensity curve changes dramatically depending on the total spin J.
That's incredibly powerful. You're basically using the external pattern of the debris to figure out the deep internal configuration of the protons and neutrons inside the nucleus.
Yes, exactly. By fitting the observed experimental curve to the theoretical predictions for different possible spins, J0, 1, 2, and so on, physicists could definitively say that the unknown spin of that Ni-20 star nucleus was J2. The rotation matrix gave them the predictive power they needed.
Okay, we've covered decay and scattering. So for the final challenge, how does the universe combine two different spins into one single coherent system? What's the rule for combining the angular momentum of two particles, say J sub A and J sub E?
The rule is that the total angular momentum, the total J, can range from the absolute difference, JJB, all the way up to the sum, J plus JB, in integer steps.
So, for example, combining a spin-half electron and a spin-1 nucleus.
Right, J is a half, JB is 1. The total J can only be 32 or 12.
But the really critical step isn't just knowing the possible totals, is it? It's defining what that combined state actually looks like.
Exactly. When you define the combined state for a specific total J, like J32, it's never a simple one-to-one mapping. It's not just electron spin-up and nucleus spin-up.
Yeah.
The total state is always a linear combination. It's an inherent superposition of the component M states.
And the numbers that define that specific superposition, those are the Clebsch-Gordan coefficients.
The Clebsch-Gordan coefficients are, well, they're like the quantum recipe, the mixing ratios. They're these numerical coefficients, like the square root of 23 or the square root of 13, that tell you exactly how much of each component state is required to form the total stable conserved state.
So it's not an arbitrary mix.
Not at all. It's mathematically precise, ensuring that the total state satisfies all the quantum rules for both J and M.
So this really shows us that in quantum mechanics, we don't just add vectors together like in classical physics. We combine probability amplitudes, and we get these stable states that are intrinsically mixtures of all the possible component parts.
And that's a good place to recap. We've covered how conservation of angular momentum determines the exact polarization of emitted light, how the quantum amplitude approach validates classical scattering results, how positronium decay reveals these deep quantum correlations, like the EPR paradox, and finally the mathematical framework, the rotation matrices and Clebsch-Gordan coefficients that we need to handle and combine these quantum spins.
So after all that, what does this all mean for you as you try to grapple with quantum reality?
I think the profound implication of this deep dive is that angular momentum forces us to accept that particles just don't possess definite fixed properties, whether that's polarization or component spin, until the moment they're actually measured.
It's not there until you look.
It isn't. Reality at the quantum level is not a collection of objects with discrete attributes. It's a complex, non-local superposition. The conservation laws govern not what is happening, but what can happen when that superposition finally collapses.
That is the true, non-intuitive nature of the quantum world laid bare. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the quantum conservation of angular momentum. We hope this knowledge helps you see the physical world in a whole new light.